Commonwealth poetry. Commonwealth was a political organization of the countries which were erstwhile colonies under the British rule for more than a century. Those countries are Canada, Australia, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Singapore, etc. It's also called literatures of these countries is called new literatures in English, the third world literature, and it's also called post-colonial literature in English. Commonwealth literature is rich in poetry and fiction, but poor in the production of drama and non-fictional prose. There are hundreds and thousands of writers from all these countries. So to say example, Raja Rao Arkanar Anita Desai from India, Chinwachwe Ole Soyinka, Nadine Godimer from Africa, and Margaret Atwood, Margaret Lawrence, they are from Canada, Derek Walcott, Lemming are from Australia, V.S. Naipaul, Braithwaite from the West Indies, A.D. Hope, Judith Wright, Patrick White from West Australia, and Kathleen Mansfield from the New Zealand. These are the prominent writers of all Commonwealth literature. The study of common literature offers the best means of pooling the resources of many cultures, suggested by Achbe's vivid phrase, humanity's heirloom. There is a quotation by C.D. Narasimhaya from his book Essays in Common Literature, Heirloom of Multiple Heritage. The early poetry was written by settlers in Australia, the New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada is of two kinds. On the one hand, we had a ballad style narrative, and on the other, we have nostalgic, often sentimental poetry of the homesick emigrant, echoing the rhythms and praises of the poems known in youth. Commonwealth poets tend to assume any one or two of the following voices in their poetry: individual voice, national voice, cosmic voice. There are certain features of Commonwealth poetry. The poets of Africa, for example, are conscious of their national identity. The image of Africa comes alive in the poetry of Roy Campbell, David Nicol, Michael de Onong, Dennis Brutus, Ole Soyinka, and J.P. Clark. The image of Australia is in Australian poetry has changed considerably since the advent of William Wentworth, who wrote his poem Australasia. The landscape and the life of the land have become central themes in Australian poetry. A.D. Hope, Judith Wright, Douglas Sturt, Mary Gilmore are the prominent. Canadian poetry is deeply entrenched in its geography and landscape. In Canada, poetry is written in both French and English, while Canadian poetry draws a great deal from the British and American fiction. It also seeks to locate itself firmly in the Canadian setting. A.J. Pratt, Duncan Campbell Scott, A.J.M. Smith, P.K. Page, Margaret Avison, Margaret Atwood, Anne Wilkinson, Robert French, Dorothy Livesey, and A.M. Klein are the prominent poets. Besides, Indian English poetry has made a significant contribution to the Commonwealth poetry and is known for its originality and authenticity and of lyrical quality. The subcontinent of India, with its vast and ancient culture, has created an indigenous literary tradition. Of course, there are early 19th century poets like Thorudat, Aurobindo, Tagore, Manmohan Ghosh, Michael, Madhusudan Dutt, early 19th century poets, and there are modern poets like C.K. Kumar, Adil Jaswala, Jayanta Matra Bantras, R. Parthasarathy, A.K. Ramanujan, and Arun Kolatkar, and Kamala Das. In New Zealand's poetry, the landscape of the country and the preoccupation with the isolated individual self are the two important characteristics in these poets share with other Commonwealth poets. Also some poets have taken up the theme of love and metaphysical concerns. Important New Zealand poets include Alan Carnau, William Pember Reeves, A.R.D. Farnham, Edward Trigger, James Baxter, and Gordon Chillis. The West Indies Canadian poets bar Caribbean poets are also largely disposed of their past. However, Derek Walcott, Evan Jones, Edward Braithwaite have created a new idiom in their poetry. Apart from India, Africa, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and West Indies, we have poems from other countries like Pakistan, Singapore, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka. And now we shall have all these poets. We shall have the study of all these poets in their poems, and all these poets belong to the discipline of Commonwealth poetry. Australian poetry is also very prominent. Australia was colonized first in 1888, and literature of the distinct was written before the end of the century. The development of Australian poetry could be divided in three divisions. The first page begins with the colonial period, but extending up to the last decade of the 19th century. Second page spans over the period of quarter of a century from the 1890s to the present times. Australian poets mainly deal with their landscape and the flood, wildfire, and they have the national spirit in their poetry, a patriotic spirit. And there are poets like Eddie Hope, who is the winner of the Commonwealth poetry in 1958. He has produced rare poetry, a distinction in Australian literature. Along with him, Judith Wright and Margaret Atwood are famous feminist poets. Our Canadian poetry came to maturity slowly and with difficulty. The development of literature, when they followed more or less the same pattern as observed in Australia, and there is also New Zealand. And there are four provinces: Quebec, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, combined one under federal government to form the Dominion. The poets of the period of Charles Meyer, Cannon, Archibald Lampton, Frederick George Scott, William Wilfred Campbell, and Marjorie Pictou. And some of these are modern poets and some of modernist poets. The modernist poets are B.K. Page, Margaret Avison, Anne Wilkinson, and Margaret Atwood. It draws his narrative powers and his sense of tragic in life. More than any other writer of the period, Scott contributed to formation of national consciousness in Canadian poetry. The New Zealand poetry There are two islands which make up New Zealand, were first colonized by the Europeans in about 1840. There are the prominent writers, men and women writers, William Pember Revs and Jessie Mackay. Three women poets of Revs, Ursula Bethel, Eileen, and Duggan and Robin Hyde, brought a deep religious feelings to the poetry of New Zealand. And African poetry is also very rich. And of course, we divide in African, South African, and North African. In North Africa, we have the poetry of Nigeria, for example, the poetry of Wole Soyinka and Achebe. The poet Wole Soyinka, who is a novelist, prose writer, and a great playwright, is awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. And we have got the poets like Gabriel Okara, Amos Tuthula, and others. Gabriel Okara is one of the famous poets in Africa. Caribbean poetry. Caribbean poetry belongs to the Caribbean islands. There's a famous collection, Voices from the Summerland in 1929, the first anthology of Jamaican poetry. We have the descriptions in their poems, the descriptions of pleasant, tropical, and colorful nature of the West Indies. During the early part of the 20th century, poets, novelists like Claude McKay, who achieved international reputation. He focused on the sufferings of the Negroes in the United States. Derek Walcott of St. Lucia, on the Nobel Prize winner, the poet of the British West Indies. There are other poets like M.J. Smith, John Figueroa, Claude McKay, and George Campbell. Pakistani poetry is equally famous because of its lyricism, use of symbolism and metaphor. And the famous poets are Alangir Hashmi, Hussain Jubairi, Shahid Soharwardi, Mumtaz Shah Nawaz. And these poets have produced a very good volume of poetry, and some of their poems are translated from Urdu. And significantly, the poetry of Singapore and also Sri Lanka and East Indies is also the part of the Commonwealth poetry. Thus, we should say that Commonwealth poetry presents an immense landscape alive with the creative energy and poetic sensibility, full of promise. These writings reflect their thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and their adherence to their culture, religion, mythology, etc. Thank you.